Patreon Project presents Point by Point, walking through a bad conversation. On occasion, I like watching some videos on YouTube that have nothing to do with religion, and I've watched like cinema sins sorts of stuff where it's like everything wrong with this movie in this many minutes. Although they seem to be getting longer and longer, maybe they're taking cues from me. I don't want to give the impression that I remotely always get it right, or think that I have all the right answers or anything else, which is why we've done interviews with other people to get their thoughts. It's why I'm open to having conversations and talking about methods. But when I do debate reviews, I also try to point out mistakes that I made when I can find them, and as well as my opponent's mistakes. But something interesting happened this week, and I think there's some valuable lessons to learn from this. Although I want to apologize a little bit in advance because I'm going to be putting on my glasses and reading a few things so that I can talk about this email discussion. And this is going to be a little bit more freeform, although I do have notes for the important points to make. Someone emailed me, and they were very polite, perhaps almost a little too polite. And the first thing that I want to note is that this email came in while I was in a bad mood and busy with several things, and it was particularly frustrating because it was essentially an email that said, you don't know what you're talking about with regard to the Bible and slavery. Now, the first tip, pro tip, if you're in a bad mood, don't answer email, don't get into debates. Sort out the other problems, get them out of the way so that you're not letting that mood spill over into your responses. Because from a standpoint of, factually accurate information and everything, I think my responses were pretty on point. From a standpoint of attitude and mood, they definitely weren't. And it colored the conversation because I don't know for sure that this person was intentionally being snarky in their original email. I'll read it and you can decide for yourself. But by the time we got to the end of the conversation where he was referring to my inaccurate knowledge of the Bible may work on those hicks that call your show, at that point, I was pretty much done. But the email started with, "Hi, Matt, just writing on an issue that seems to come up often, slavery in Exodus 21. What was happening in the Bible and Hebrew culture was not slavery as the term is understood in modern times." Now, as soon as I read that sentence, I was like, holy crap, here we go again. The reason that I did the slavery video for the Atheist Debates Project is because I'd had a number of conversations with people, and I wanted to address the most common apologetics. One, that what the Bible's talking about isn't slavery as you think of it, in early history of the United States. It's not modern slavery, it's not chattel slavery. It's only indentured servitude. That's not accurate, already addressed, but even if it were accurate, it doesn't change the morality of it. He continues, Exodus 21 does not, underlined, endorse slavery as that term is understood by most people. Exodus 21 says that if you beat a bonded servant and he dies, you don't get a free pass just because he's your servant. You actually get the death penalty. Exodus 21 gives rights to servants, slaves in your language, not to their masters. So it doesn't actually say that you die if you beat a bonded servant. An earlier verse says that anyone who strikes another person to cause their death will die. This is the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, death for death sort of mentality of the Bible. But that anybody may not apply to every person. You have to remember that these are, first of all, laws being given to the Jews, and the Jews had a special place. There were different laws for slavery for Jews. I get to some of that in my response, so I won't go over it too much. But to tell you what was going through my head as I read this is the first thing is, he's raising the points that we've already addressed. He's bought into the standard apologetics, and he clearly, I don't think he's seen my video, which covers this, which addresses some of the modern apologetics. The text says that, he continues, the text says that if you injure someone, you must pay them loss compensation. That's context for the next part. It says that if you beat your servant and he recovers quickly, then the master doesn't have to pay lost time compensation because the servant was working off his debt anyway and has not lost anything in terms of income. Now, I didn't address this specifically, but that sentence is an infusion of a whole bunch of extra information on top of what's actually said. He continues writing on, when you read any document, you need to read it all. And I skipped over some stuff because he says the Bible does not endorse the owning of people as property in the sense I use the word. You're seeing a few buzzwords without interrogating the text to see what it's really being described. Then he feels it's important to remind me that the Bible wasn't written in English. The Old Testament is in Hebrew, and not every Jew sees on. So from my standpoint, as I'm reading this, not only is he offering the same old trite apologetics, but he is saying that because he and I disagree, clearly I don't understand that the Bible was originally written in Hebrew, and I'm relying on English understandings of this. And he says, as you know, in Hebrew Exodus 21, kidnappers got the death penalty, which is something else I've addressed, this idea of man stealing is not co-equal with slavery. And he says what was happening in Hebrew civil law in the Old Testament was not a property relationship, as you use the word. People weren't owned in the sense of cattle or chattels any more than someone in modern times is owned just because they're subject to a contractual obligation. Here's someone desperately trying to spin the fact that the Bible says that you buy your slaves from the heathen that surround you and they become your property that you can pass on to your children, and rework this as if it's only talking about indentured servitude and a contractual obligation, as if there were contracts and reasonable rights and laws. It's frustrating. So my first reply was, I'm afraid you're simply wrong about tossing out the same apologetics. Have you actually watched my video on slavery? Because your points are already addressed and countered. Stop making excuses for the immoral Bible and be a decent person. I don't have too much problem with that. That's honestly how I felt. This was me in a bad mood responding to what I viewed as some snark from him and some monumental arrogance. To assume that I somehow didn't realize that the Bible was written in Hebrew and that there may be translation issues. So he wrote back, I've watched a lot of your videos and I don't know exactly which one you mean. I do. It's the one on slavery. Maybe you're not familiar with the Atheist Debates Praetor project, which is where this video is going. But I sent him a link. And he says, but I'm guessing I've heard the atheist apologetics you're referring to before. First of all, it's not atheist apologetics. It's responses to Christian apologetics, to biblical apologists. But he says, give me the link and I'll double check. That's to be appreciated. I hear you state often that it's immoral to own another human being. I agree, but I don't think that's what the Bible is advocating. I think you've seized on buzzwords and have neglected to take in what's really going on in the Old Testament. You don't know me, so why suggest I'm not a decent person? That's simple. Because you've made assumptions about me. You were somewhat condescending. You've tossed out the same old tired apologetics, which have already been addressed, and you've injected a whole bunch of context in order to make excuses for what the Bible actually says, whether it's slavery or indentured servitude, and it's slavery. What the Bible is suggesting is immoral, and this individual misrepresented something. I wrote back and I said the Bible expressly permits owning of human beings, referring to them as money or property, and allows them to be passed on as inheritance. I linked to my video. You wrote in with an assertion that I was wrong or didn't understand the context, but you misrepresent what is actually stated in Exodus 21, and you ignored the other verses in Leviticus and Deuteronomy on the same subject. There's only one right answer. Thou shalt not own thy fellow human being, period. That would have made a good commandment. Trying to shrug it off as indentured servitude, which is also immoral, when it wasn't, doesn't fly. Just to show you were wrong from the start, Exodus 21 says, if you beat a bonded servant and you die, you don't just get a free pass because he's your servant. You actually get the death penalty. Exodus 21 gives rights to servants, not their masters. That's what he says, Exodus 21 says. But what Exodus 21 actually says is that if a man beats his male or female servant with a rod so that he dies under his hand, he shall be punished. It doesn't say what the punishment is, and it may in fact be death. But slaves are a second category, and I don't think that it's fair to just assume that anybody hitting someone and causing their death results in them being executed. I'm not sure that it's fair to say this applies to slaves, which are property. But also it says in the following verse, notwithstanding, if he remain alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property. Now, setting aside the property thing, if you beat your slave and he doesn't die, you won't be punished. And yet what this individual wrote to me was that Exodus 21 says that if you beat a bonded servant and he dies, you don't get a free pass. He didn't bother to address that if you beat a bonded servant and he doesn't die, you do get a free pass. You can beat someone as long as they don't die within a day or two, and you get a free pass. Which I note in my email response that this is fundamentally different from what the Bible says on other subjects. Between two people, it's an eye for an eye, a tooth for tooth, life for life. But if you put out a slave's eye or a tooth, you are not required to give up an eye or tooth. You just have to let him go. So there's a good case to be made that if you kill your slave, that does not mean that you will then suffer the death penalty. There may be some other penalty involved. It may be death, may not. But you don't just get to read into it and revamp things so that they sound the way you want. And he wrote back, still being nice. Thanks for your time, Matt. I know you're busy and much appreciated. I like to chat these things through. I bet you get emails from all kinds of people all the time. I'm grateful you've taken the time with me. Maintaining the high road, which at this point in the conversation, I'm no longer that interested in. And that's a mistake. And this raises one of the first points that I want to make sure I address. There's a common tactic among some apologists. It's named after apologist Duane Gish, and it's called the Gish Gallop. And what happens is they will state a whole bunch of information. By now they should have the understanding that you're never going to be able to address everything they say. As a matter of fact, it might take 10 times as long just to address one of the many things that they've said. And so when it's their turn to speak next, instead of dealing with the things that you addressed, they highlight the things you didn't address as if you were avoiding them, as if you didn't have an answer to them, when in fact you just may not have had time, or you may have focused on just one thing for the sake of making that point. In some ways, both of us in this conversation have engaged in a little bit of a Gish Gallop. He made a couple claims, and instead of addressing them point by point, as I should have done and as I'm recommending, I responded to that and said, and also this and this and this and this and this. It was in my mind an attempt to say, here's a whole bunch of stuff, go deal with it. And when you find answers, come back, because I got other stuff to do. What I should have done was addressed only one point about either property or beating them or the death penalty or anything, and had the conversation on that point until either one of us concedes the point or we get to some understanding that allows us to move forward. Apart from that, the conversation's over. Because if the Bible is immoral in 20 positions, you only need to show one that they can't respond to, and they no longer get to claim that the Bible's a morally perfect book, or that it's offering good instruction when it's not. What he wrote back was that I know you see the words property and money, but like I said, look at what is meant by property. The reference to property is simply in the context of the master having a proprietary right to have a servant work off their debt. So once again, he's injecting stuff in that's not there. He's using his modern poisonous apologetics to, he says, and how it was used. And of course, money was involved. That was the whole point of the argument. He's saying he doesn't understand that money is co-equal to property in the Bible. And he says, I can deal with every other verse in the Bible on this topic. I just don't want to give you a long essay. I figured you don't have the time. But if I can, and if you genuinely want to, I'm guessing you don't, you quoted the same text I was working from. Interpret it properly, though, Matt. Read all the verses around it. Read verse 19. It talks about non-servant relationships, where if you injure someone, then you pay them compensation for any loss of time. Yes, it does. And as you note, that's for non-servant relationships. The mere fact that we have a set of rules for how people deal with other people and a set of rules for how people deal with slaves means that you don't get to point to the interactions between people and non-servants and say that this also applies to servants. Then he says, In verse 26, if you injure your servant, you have to pay him compensation. In some cases, if the injury was bad enough, the servant goes free, no matter how large the debt. And tries to make the case that perhaps if you owed $100,000 and somebody knocked out your tooth and you were allowed to go free, that'd be a pretty good deal. Well, if I owed someone $100,000 and they said, hey, I'll let you go free if you let me knock out your tooth, I might consider it. I might even take them up on it. But if I owed someone $100,000, we have better ways to deal with that than making me a servant that is bound indefinitely or permanently and allowed to be beaten as long as they don't die. Oh, I may have to offer some compensation. But additionally, verse 26, I'll set aside that apologetics because I don't want to make this video too much about slavery, although I probably already have. It's about my thoughts in this conversation, his thoughts in this conversation, and a cautionary tale about how both of our biases made this conversation turn incredibly ugly. When he says, with respect, I think you haven't thought it through properly. I work as a lawyer, and if I went into a courtroom and threw literal non-contextual meanings of words at a judge, I'd get taken to task. But that's what you're doing, seizing on the facade of words and not thinking through what's really going on. I have a few pet peeves. Don't treat me like I'm stupid. Don't force me to repeat myself. Don't waste my time. And he's managed to do all of those. When I've spent years on this specific topic and researched it thoroughly, going back to the original Hebrew, looking at it contextually, and noting that what the Bible does is set up a set of laws for how Jews interact with Jews, a set of laws for how Jews interact with non-Jews, and a set of laws for how Jews interact with their slaves, that I've actually thought it through pretty thoroughly. And when this individual starts off with things that aren't factually accurate, when he says that slaves have to be let go after 7 years, and doesn't seem to know that this only applies to Jewish male slaves and not non-Jewish slaves and female Jewish slaves, they're not let go after 7 years, then it seems that he hasn't been particularly thorough. And this is where I replied with something, because he makes a quick comment at the end about if God exists and he likes slavery, then why does the New Testament say that slave traders won't inherit the kingdom of God? And I'm going to read you my response and explain it because I screwed this up, and yet I was completely right. I said, it's typical of modern Pauline Christians to accuse me of taking things out of context while they cherry pick a single verse from 1 Timothy that references slave traders. First of all, a private letter from Paul, which eventually gets canonized, doesn't or shouldn't have the same authority of the law in Exodus, publicly delivered from God, or from God's purported messenger, and certainly shouldn't trump Jesus' views. Second, Paul's mention of the slave traders isn't necessarily a pronouncement against slavery. It may be a translation error of him referencing the man-stealing verse, which were already prohibited in the Old Testament law. Slave traders aren't the same as slave owners. Third, Jesus never condemns slavery and only encourages slaves to obey their master, even the cruel masters. This is wrong. If anything, it demonstrates that Jesus isn't moral and doesn't understand morality. And then I go into more detail on this and, how if God or Jesus were actually moral and understood human rights or valued human rights, they would have said much different things about slavery. And what I've done here is the same thing I cautioned against, which was I'm going to give a whole bunch of stuff. And instead of addressing the point that we were actually discussing, I allowed him to direct us to a new point, and I made some new claims about those points. And the claims are such that he just gets to be dismissive. He's essentially saying, oh, now you're saying we shouldn't listen to what the apostles wrote. That's secondary to the law of Moses. Seriously, you're now deciding what's canon? No, I'm not actually deciding what's canon. I'm pointing out that modern Christianity is based far more on what Paul wrote than what Jesus said. And Paul had disagreements with the apostles. He wasn't one of the disciples. And he had disagreements with Peter, which are recorded. And yet Paul's version became popular. Now you can say that Paul's version is divinely inspired by God, and you can go down that apologetics route, but you have to understand that when you do so, you are saying that Paul's view, which seems to contradict the laws in Exodus and Leviticus, and which aren't mentioned or supported at all by Jesus, that Paul's take has a primacy over those others. And at a minimum, you have to acknowledge that there's a contradiction or a contrast between what these things are saying. But by saying this, by saying that, maybe I said translation error for slave traders, when what I meant is that, given the limits of language, his slave trader comment might have just been how his comments about man stealing, taken from the Old Testament, were actually translated. That was all a mistake. And from there, there was some snarkiness back and forth where he mentions Jesus. And I'm like, well, if Jesus had actually said something about, or negative about slavery, maybe we'd be having a different conversation than we are. Be cautious about, just because you have a lot of information that could potentially show that someone's position is utterly untenable. Tossing it all out at once allows the bulk of it to be ignored while they pick the weakest point, or what they perceive to be the weakest point, to address in response. And if you do this in multiple stages, which we both did, here's a whole bunch of stuff, let me respond to these and add these. Let me respond to those. Oh, I'm going to pick this one and this one. I'm going to ignore these, and then I'm going to add this. The conversation derails. And it started with an email that I viewed as, you don't know what the hell you're talking about. And then it got worse and got into the, I'm a lawyer and we're talking about the law and interpretations of the law. And one point I didn't make that I wanted to make was that he seems to be arguing that the general trumps the specific, which is the inverse of the way laws are. If you were to say, no one is allowed to own a gun except blah, 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 the specific exception trumps the general. And so saying anybody who strikes another person so that they die, they shall be put to death as well, that may be trumped by a specific subset of laws that show slaves as second-class citizens without the rights of others. What ends up happening is somebody takes a look at that and picks the weakest argument, and perhaps we're both guilty of that too, although I think I addressed almost everything he said, and portrays that weakest argument as if it's their best argument. Now, years ago on the show, Jeff D had a way of dealing with callers, which I wish I would use more often. I think it's a good idea. And somebody says, oh, I got evidence or proof of the existence of God. What we know happens is somebody gives an argument, we respond, and then they go back and revamp that argument, or they switch to a different argument, etc. And Jeff's point was, give me your best argument. Because if your best argument is insufficient, there's really not much point in going on to the others. If we're trying to figure out who committed this crime, and your best evidence, your best argument is that I can't think of anybody other than the butler who could have done it, that's a bad argument. And if that represents your best argument, then the other ones which are worse aren't really worth that much time. Otherwise, they'd be the best one. Kind of the way it works. It's a good idea from Jeff. So when you can, pick a single point. Don't necessarily say, so your best argument is. If they give you 5 arguments, don't say, so your best argument is this one, because that's the one you can address. Instead, perhaps start with the first one. Or, better yet, reply, you've given me 5 arguments. That's a lot to go over. Which one of those do you think is your best? Because I'd like to start with that one first and take this step by step. Probably the most important thing to remember is that nobody's perfect, and conversations are going to go badly, and people are going to have bad days, and you are going to say and do bad things just as we all do. But if you are cognizant of this, if you are willing to take stock of what you've said and reevaluate and say, you know what? Yes, this could have been done better. Here's a better strategy to get us both on the same page. Here's a better strategy to keep us from, just dismissing the other. He dismisses me as a dilettante who only talks to hicks. And then I point out that, hey, I've debated some of the world's foremost Christian apologists and blah, 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 and I don't know that they'd like being called hicks. And then he comes back with, no, I was saying the callers on your show are hicks. And I come back with, yeah, now you're just name-calling people and putting yourself in a position of superiority as if you're right when you've offered no actual rebuttal other than injecting all kinds of lawyer context and blah, blah, blah. It's awful. And those are the conversations that I often learn from and try to change the way that I do things. If I had it to do over again, and I really don't have the time, and at this point there's probably not much use, I think that my first response was fine. And when he kept coming back with stuff before he'd even watched the video, I still to this day don't know if he's watched the slavery video because he doesn't seem to address the points in it or recognize that there are counters to his points. But I think my second one would have been, here's a video expressly talking about what my specific objections to slavery are. Look through it, pick out a point that you want to address, and we can talk about that when we both have time. Done. You can put a pause, you can put a pin in any conversation, pause and come back at another time. You're not obligated to meet somebody else's time schedule. Maybe you're busy. Who knows? So that's an example from this week of several lessons learned. I don't think it was the worst conversation ever. I think that there were, good points and good rebuttals made. But it started off bad because I was in a bad mood and that person was being, in my mind, a little snarky, a little dismissive, a little superior, and clearly hadn't bothered to study the subject as much as I had. Because if he had, he couldn't have made some of the statements that he made. That is a conclusion I reached, and I've reached it many times, where if you have some expertise in some area and you witness someone speaking about it, you know right away whether they know more about it than you do or less about it than you do, whether they are a victim of Dunning-Kruger, whether their mind has been poisoned by modern apologetics that are anachronistic and inject all sorts of things, beginning with an assumption that God is moral and could not endorse something immoral like chattel slavery. And now we need to look through the text to find a way to make it not say that. There are ways to expose that. There are ways to have this conversation that are far better than what I actually did. So, learn from my mistakes. Doesn't mean that something like this isn't going to happen again. Doesn't mean that you're not going to make the same mistakes. But being aware of it and being open and willing to acknowledge this, change the way you interact, and try to have improved conversations is really the best way to get better at doing it. See you next time. This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.